Welcome back, sleepyheads. Tonight, we travel to a time when romance was legally discouraged, love songs hadn't been invented, and nothing said "I do" like a sack of turnips. That's right. We're diving into the heartwarming tradition of medieval marriage. Spoiler, it's got zero warmth and even less choice. Marriage back then wasn't about soulmates. It was about surviving winter, consolidating pig assets, and making sure your cousin didn't accidentally marry the same person twice. You didn't get down on one knee. You got down because your gout flared up and the priest was yelling. Weddings weren't planned by brides. They were orchestrated by elders who thought kissing caused plagues and that emotions were an expensive waste of grain. So dim the lights, maybe light a candle that smells like regret and cabbage, and settle in. Because tonight, you're not falling in love. You're being traded for vinegar and family reputation. Let's begin. You wake up to the sound of a chicken screaming outside your window. Not metaphorically. Literally screaming. It sits on your windowsill like a feathery prophet of doom, shrieking as if it knows something you don't. You sit up, blinking into the damp morning light, only to find your mother already mid-sentence, mid-scrub, and mid-vinegar. Up! It's happening, she mutters, dragging a rag across your face with the tenderness of a woman cleaning vegetables. You ask what it is, but she's already moved on to brushing your hair like it owes her money. In between strokes, she mutters vague affirmations about duty, blessings, and how lucky you are they still have a veil that hasn't been chewed by rats. Your father grunts from the corner of the room, which in your house doubles as both his bed and your breakfast table. It's his way of saying good morning. You interpret this as approval. This is the most emotional support he's offered since the time you survived that suspicious meat stew last winter. You try to return the energy with a half smile. It doesn't stick. There is no joy here, no butterflies, no teenage elation, just the dull knowledge that before the sun sets, you will be married to someone whose personality has been summarized by your aunt as he's got solid elbows and doesn't spit in public. Outside, the village is already stirring, which is a problem because you haven't even put on pants yet. News travels fast when there are only 7 family names in circulation and 5 of them are directly involved in your betrothal. The baker drops off 2 loaves from yesterday, which he now calls ceremonial bread. The blacksmith arrives with a bottle of wine that smells like firewood and sorrow. Your cousin, of course, comes to judge. Your ceremonial robe is waiting. It hasn't fit properly since you turned 12, and its last official use was at a funeral. The veil smells like regret and incense. You slide into the outfit with all the enthusiasm of someone stepping into a tax audit. Your youngest sibling, eyes wide and unbothered by the emotional weight of the day, offers you a pine cone for luck. You take it, mostly because it's the only gesture today that doesn't come with unsolicited commentary. The sun is out, aggressively cheerful. You step outside into a breeze that feels like it's judging your posture. A goat sneezes in your general direction. Your sandals are already falling apart, but they'll hold as long as you don't walk anywhere interesting. You're not marrying for love, laughter, or even decent conversation. You're marrying because your uncle looked at a plot of barley and thought, that's worth a niece. Your hands tremble slightly as you step forward, not with anticipation, with the weight of generations who did the same thing and called it tradition. Congratulations, you're getting married, whether you want to or not. You grew up hearing stories about love. Not from your family, of course. They were too busy fermenting things and managing livestock. But from that one travelling minstrel who once sang about a knight kissing a milkmaid behind a granary. Your cousin threw a turnip at him, which is how you learned that romance is both unrealistic and punishable by root vegetable. In this village, love is a garnish, something that looks nice in stories but has no place in the main dish of survival. Marriage here isn't about feelings, it's a transaction, a merger, a way to consolidate assets that include goats, seasonal tax exemptions, and the hope that your future children will have better teeth. You are not expected to fall in love. You are expected to fall into line. If affection does appear, it's considered a fortunate side effect, like when the cow births twins or your father manages to go a whole winter without yelling at the moon. The truth is, love complicates things. It inspires bold ideas, dangerous questions, and poetry. And everyone knows where poetry leads: bankruptcy, scandal, and dramatic sighing. No, it's better to pair people the way one pairs shoes, by size, durability, and approximate color. Compatibility is measured in grain stores and pig weight, not whether you laugh at the same jokes, especially since you're not allowed to tell jokes, or laugh, or have feelings unrelated to the harvest. Your parents have already exchanged glances over a ledger, nodded twice, and consulted the village elder, who reportedly chooses matches based on a combination of moon phases and joint flexibility. You didn't even know you were eligible until your mother casually mentioned, while grating radish over last night's porridge, that the neighbor's son is no longer hideous and only smells like garlic when it's humid. And just like that, you were part of a negotiation. Not a conversation, a negotiation. You are not the speaker. You are the clause near the bottom that everyone pretends to read. Your name is bartered like a particularly resilient mule. The dowry is discussed in measured tones: a plot of land with excellent drainage, a cartwheel that almost works, and a vinegar barrel with only minor ghost activity. You are told to smile during these discussions, not because it will help, but because it makes the room look less tense when everyone is quietly panicking about sheep futures. You nod politely, even when the potential groom's uncle asks if you are of hearty constitution and capable of lifting at least one chicken per arm. Sometimes, you wonder what love feels like. You think maybe it's similar to the way you feel when the wind shifts and doesn't smell like cabbage. Or that rare moment when your older sibling forgets to insult you at dinner. Mostly, you imagine it involves fewer spreadsheets, but you won't be finding out. Not here, not now. Your heart is a background character in a play starring land deeds and family alliances. It wears muted colors and exits early. Because in medieval marriages, love isn't expected and it's tolerated, occasionally, from a distance. You know that moment when you realize your life is being decided by people who think sarcasm is a sin and believe constipation is inherited? That's what choosing a spouse feels like. Except you're not doing the choosing. You're the prize, or the burden, or, depending on how your last harvest went, a little of both. Either way, the decision is made somewhere between the kitchen fire and the neighbor's goat pen, and your opinion is less relevant than the weather forecast, which, coincidentally, is also mostly guesswork and deeply pessimistic. Marriage here is a collaborative process, like rebuilding a barn or surviving winter. It requires input from your parents, your extended relatives, the village elder, the priest, and occasionally someone who once saw your intended from across a field and declared them well-proportioned from the knees upward. You are consulted in the same way furniture is consulted. Someone checks for cracks, knocks once or twice, and then moves on. Your mother begins the process by making a list, not of qualities, don't be silly, but of eligible families with decent oxen and low scandal density. From there, it's a numbers game. Land meets land, name meets name. And you meet someone who is technically your age but emotionally resembles a slightly damp loaf of bread. If you're lucky, the matchmaking goes quickly. If not, it drags on for weeks, involving whispered negotiations over who gets to keep the better storage shed and whether Aunt Marjorie's debt to the miller will follow the bride or remain conveniently forgotten. You sit through these meetings like a decorative urn, occasionally being referred to as she, or less charitably, the one with the eyebrows. Your father, ever the romantic, insists the key to a successful union is shared values and complementary livestock. Your grandmother wants you married before your teeth start doing that thing. Your cousin offers unsolicited feedback about your nose, then suggests marrying into the pickle family because they throw excellent funerals. Meanwhile, the potential suitor is undergoing the same process across the village. He's likely being asked questions such as, can he lift a barrel without wheezing? And would he survive one night alone in a root cellar? If the answers are yes and probably, congratulations, you've got a match. Eventually, the two family groups arrange a meeting. You are presented like an over-polished gourd, draped in whatever fabric hasn't been gnawed by mice. The suitor arrives in his ceremonial tunic, which smells faintly of anxiety and sheep. You exchange 3 glances, 2 nods, and half a smile, all while maintaining the posture of someone being evaluated for public execution. This is your moment. Your big chance to fall in love, or at least into mutual tolerance. But mostly, it's your chance to not mess things up for your family. So you say something neutral about the weather, laugh politely at a comment about soil drainage, and pretend not to notice the way he blinks like he's afraid of eye contact. You're not choosing each other. You're being selected by committee, a fragile, gossip-fueled committee that believes courtship is best conducted through third-party rumors and veiled insults. And in this context, silence is the loudest form of agreement. Here's how it works. You're not just a person, you're a package, a bundle deal that includes your charming disposition, irrelevant, your ability to churn butter, mildly appreciated, and most importantly, your dowry, which is the medieval equivalent of a wedding subscription box, except instead of receiving something delightful each month, your future husband receives everything now, and you spend the rest of your life being grateful you were traded for 2 goats, a corner of a barley field, and a jug of vinegar with minimal floaters. The dowry isn't optional, it's required, expected, and meticulously itemized. Your parents don't negotiate it, they weaponize it. A larger dowry means better social standing, a more ambitious marriage, and possibly a husband who only hits the wall when he's angry, not you. A smaller dowry means settling for someone who believes personal hygiene is a seasonal event and thinks conversation is for people who haven't yet discovered grunting. It starts with an inventory. Your mother pulls out a wax tablet and begins listing everything she thinks you're worth. Not metaphorically, literally. A linen shift with only 3 holes, 2 combs, one of which still has most of its teeth, a wooden chest full of dreams, regret, and some decently folded undergarments. These are your assets. Then come the liquid holdings. A small wine cask, mostly full, 2 jars of honey, partially crystallized, and a bottle of perfume that might also be lamp oil. There's also a rug that once belonged to your great-aunt and still smells faintly of time and unresolved arguments. Next, the livestock. Because nothing says marital potential like a goat that doesn't bite, and a hen that lays emotionally stable eggs. If you're particularly valuable, or your family is particularly desperate, you might be offered with half a cow, not a cow and a half a cow. No one knows which half, it's a metaphor, probably. Once everything is tallied, the negotiations begin. These are not light-hearted discussions, they're tense, strategic dialogues that feel one goat short of a hostage exchange. Your father paces. Your future father-in-law frowns. The priest steps in only to offer moral support and remind everyone that greed is a sin, but also, have you seen the price of wheat? Some families inflate the dowry with optimism. This jug is filled with imported vinegar, they'll say, knowing full well it was brewed behind the outhouse. Others subtract silently, pretending the missing wool cloak was always more of a concept than a possession. Eventually they reach an agreement. Hands are shaken, wine is poured. You are not consulted, you are informed. Your mother hugs you tightly and says, "You're so lucky," while your aunt quietly mutters something about having been traded for significantly less and still making it work. The final agreement is copied onto parchment, signed, stamped, and blessed. It's a binding contract, one that ensures your marriage is built on a solid foundation of vinegar, poultry, and quiet desperation. In theory, the dowry protects you. In practice, it prices you. And in medieval marriage, everyone wants value for their money, even if that value is mostly stored in jars. There comes a time in every medieval child's life when they stop being adorable and start being economically useful. That time is roughly 12, give or take a year or 3. depending on how many teeth you still have and whether you can be trusted not to drop the family chicken. Puberty is less a biological milestone and more a signal flare to every matchmaking aunt within a 5-mile radius that you're now eligible to be bundled into a legally binding life partnership. For girls, the age of marriage can start alarmingly early. 12 is common, 14 is expected, 16 is pushing your luck. If you hit 17 unmarried, people stop calling you a daughter and start calling you a problem. The local priest might begin slipping in prayers for your social salvation between sermons about humility and leprosy. Your mother will start using the phrase ripe age with increasing desperation. Boys, meanwhile, get a bit more runway. They're expected to be old enough to own a tunic without holes, carry firewood without collapsing, and, ideally, grow some kind of facial hair. Not a beard, necessarily. Just anything that implies testosterone and a willingness to inherit debt. 16 is young but acceptable. 18 is normal. 20 is the point where people start whispering about monkhood. The assumption isn't that you're ready for marriage, it's that you're ready to stop being your parents' financial responsibility. A girl is married off the moment she looks like she can survive childbirth without immediately dying. A boy is married off the moment he looks like he might not. It's less about maturity and more about survivability, which in medieval times is a deeply generous standard. And the strange part? No one thinks this is strange. To them, you're not being rushed. You're being timed. There's a small window between too young to bear children and too old to attract a dowry. And if you miss it, your only remaining option is the convent, or a suspiciously long life of spinsterhood, which in local folklore is the same thing but with more cats and fewer holidays. Even the wedding itself reinforces this youthfulness. You're treated like a child being dressed up for a festival, bathed, brushed, bundled in ceremonial layers, and told repeatedly to smile and stop fidgeting. Your aunt brings you a wreath made of dried lavender and sighs, "I was your age when I married." Your uncle had all his original fingers back then. You nod, unsure which part of that is supposed to be comforting. No one asks how you feel. Feelings are not age-appropriate. What matters is that you've reached the age where your body is deemed functional, your family is tired of feeding you, and your marital prospects are still high enough that someone might take you off their hands before you start developing opinions. You are, by every social metric, of age. You are also, by every emotional metric, deeply underqualified. But that's not your concern, that's adulthood now, surprise. Before you walk down the aisle, or more accurately the muddy patch between the pig trough and the church, there's business to be done. Serious, complicated, legally binding business conducted by people who own more than one table and use the word provisions without irony. This is the pre-marriage negotiation, a delicate dance of promises, loopholes, and passive-aggressive goat counting. The families gather in a candlelit room that smells of ink, wax, and barely restrained panic. On one side sits your father, who's wearing his talking to important people cloak. On the other is your future father-in-law, flanked by his 2 brothers and a cousin, who allegedly reads, between them, a priest, a scribe, and an intimidating scroll longer than your hopes and dreams combined. The negotiations begin with property. Not your property, you don't have any, but the stuff people assume you might someday inherit if the stars align. 3 uncles die mysteriously, and a generous plague wipes out your second cousins. This is called contingent future interest, and it's the closest you'll ever come to being a stock option. Then comes the livestock. Every animal must be accounted for, categorized, and inflated in value. A cow that's limped since birth becomes robust of spirit. A goat with anger issues is described as spirited and alert. Your family insists the chickens are fertile. The other family counters that they're terrifying. A compromise is reached. Include the chickens, but don't guarantee their mood. Land boundaries are next. 2 families argue over 3 feet of field, a crumbling fence, and whether the stream counts as a water feature or a seasonal flood trap. Someone threatens to bring in a local elder for arbitration. The priest intervenes with a Bible quote and a warning that greed is unbecoming. The scribe continues writing, silently translating every insult into Latin. And then, just when things start to calm down, someone brings up inheritance rights, specifically what happens if your husband dies. This prompts an impassioned debate about widows, remarriage, and who gets the vinegar barrel. You learn for the first time that you may be entitled to a third of the estate, unless that estate includes a wheelbarrow, in which case the wheelbarrow goes to his cousin Gerald, because that's just how things are done. Once the assets are hashed out, the obligations begin. Your husband agrees to house, feed, and not immediately abandon you. You agree to be obedient, industrious, fertile, and ideally silent. These terms are written down, sealed with wax, and witnessed by 3 men who once collectively lost a sheep and decided not to talk about it. No one mentions love, or affection, or compatibility. Those aren't terms with legal weight, but there is a clause about what happens if you fail to produce a male heir within 5 years. Spoiler. It involves prayer, finger-pointing, and possibly an annulment filed on a Tuesday. By the end, your future has been priced, mapped, itemized, and notarized. The document is folded with ceremony and placed in a box that doubles as a footstool. You are now legally pre-married. Romance begins at ratification. If you think your wedding is a personal affair between 2 people and maybe a nosy aunt, think again. In medieval Europe, your marriage is less about romance and more about religious compliance, like a group project where God gets top billing and you're mostly there to nod in the right places. The church isn't just present, it's running the whole event, charging admission, and reminding you not to enjoy it too much. From the moment the match is agreed upon, the local priest inserts himself like a sanctified project manager. His job is to ensure that your union aligns with the will of God, the teachings of Scripture, and the vague expectations of canon law, which, conveniently, he interprets on a sliding scale, based on tithes and the number of times your uncle interrupted Mass last month. He's not just there to bless the marriage, he's also there to remind everyone that marriage is a sacred burden and that fun is a slippery slope toward eternal damnation. Before the ceremony can even happen, your marriage must be announced to the congregation via banns. These are read aloud in church for 3 consecutive Sundays, giving everyone in town 3 solid chances to object, though no one ever does unless there's money, scandal, or unusually strong cider involved. It's less a public announcement and more of a medieval gossip trap. Once the bans are cleared and no distant cousin has come forward claiming you're already married to a cousin's cousin by shared baptismal water, the church gives its blessing. In theory, this means your marriage is valid in the eyes of God. In practice, it means the priest gets to charge a fee, remind you of the dangers of lust, and lecture the congregation about the importance of piety while eyeing the wine table like it owes him money. The ceremony itself is a masterclass in ritual discomfort. You and your future spouse are required to stand in front of the altar, facing each other like 2 peasants about to exchange awkward produce. The priest speaks in Latin, a language you do not understand but nod along to with practiced confusion. If you're lucky, someone whispers the key parts in your ear, so you know when to grunt in agreement. There is no "you may kiss the bride" moment. That's not holy, that's disgusting. The church would prefer if your lips never touched unless legally required, and preferably under a wool blanket in the dark. Physical affection is not part of the ceremony. It's something you endure later for the sake of procreation, like taxes or seasonal boils. But perhaps the most important role the church plays is in reminding you that this marriage is forever. No divorce, no do-overs, no experimental trial periods. Once the vows are said, and the priest has thrown enough holy water to drown your doubts, you are locked into this sacred bond until death or plague do you part. So yes, the church sanctifies your marriage, but it also supervises it, critiques it, and charges you for the privilege. And if you ever forget that marriage is a holy obligation, not a personal choice, don't worry. The priest will remind you every Sunday. Forever. In theory, courtship is about getting to know your future spouse, learning their thoughts, their voice, perhaps the way their eyebrow arches when someone says fertile acreage. In practice, medieval courting is mostly silence, supervision, and strategic glimpses of fabric. If romance is a fire, this is the wet kindling stage where sparks are frowned upon, and anything resembling actual heat is cause for a formal complaint. Your first meeting might take place at a church, during a festival, or in someone's turnip field. You won't be alone. You will be flanked by a minimum of 3 relatives, 2 livestock, and 1 neighbor pretending not to listen. The goal of this encounter is not to connect emotionally, but to observe each other discreetly while pretending not to. If your eyes meet for longer than a second, someone will cough loudly and bring up the weather. Touching is out of the question. So is speaking freely. So is expressing any opinion stronger than a nod. The entire interaction is a balancing act between appearing interested and avoiding accusations of impropriety. One misplaced compliment and you've either proposed marriage or committed blasphemy, depending on which elder is judging that day. Most of the getting to know you process is actually handled through reputation, hearsay, and unsolicited commentary from relatives who once saw your intended walk through a market without tripping. Your aunt insists he has a sturdy posture and the right number of ears. Your uncle claims she milks goats with efficiency and doesn't blink too much. Somehow, these become the cornerstones of your emotional preparation. Gift-giving is occasionally permitted, but within tight boundaries. Flowers are acceptable as long as they're local and not too fragrant. Poems are risky, especially if you've written them yourself. One poorly constructed metaphor involving a plum blossom and someone's earlobe can haunt you for seasons. The safest option is food, a dried fig, a ribbon-wrapped carrot, or, if you're feeling bold, a honeyed walnut, wrapped, of course, to avoid any suggestion of indecency. Even eye contact is a loaded gesture. A glance may signal admiration. A longer look might imply desire or constipation. It's difficult to say. You learn to communicate entire emotional landscapes through a half smile and the position of your elbows. Meanwhile, your chaperone, usually a cousin with boundary issues, watches like a hawk trained in disapproval. If you're lucky, there might be music in the background, something light, something religious, something that allows you to momentarily imagine this isn't the most emotionally sterile moment of your life. But then someone sneezes and the spell is broken. Your future spouse is ushered away. You are handed a piece of bread and told you did well. You return home having met someone in the medieval sense, seen them briefly, failed to offend anyone, and successfully avoided scandal. You are praised for your modesty, your composure, and your ability to say absolutely nothing for an hour and still be considered charming. This is courtship, a quiet, awkward audition for a lifelong role you won't rehearse again until the wedding. And if that doesn't sound romantic, it's not supposed to. Once your families have haggled over vinegar barrels and livestock with the intensity of a minor war negotiation, and the church has weighed in with holy approval and a modest fee, it's time for the banns. This is the part of the medieval wedding process where your upcoming union is announced to the entire village 3 times, publicly, in church, while you sit there pretending not to hear. The banns are, in theory, a safeguard, a way for anyone to object to the marriage before it's finalized. In practice, they are a medieval version of social media, loud, invasive, and full of opinions you didn't ask for. The priest reads your names aloud on 3 consecutive Sundays, ensuring that everyone in the community has ample time to come forward with objections, questions, or unrelated gossip disguised as moral concern. You don't get to hide during this. You sit in a pew as still as a nervous statue, while your name echoes off stone walls and is met with a chorus of turned heads and whispered judgments. It's like being called out in school assembly, except the stakes are lifetime commitment and possible inheritance disputes. The banns include your name, your spouse-to-be's name, your respective villages, and the fact that you are intending to enter holy matrimony. The phrasing is generous. No one has asked if you're intending anything. You're simply the subject of a very public, very awkward, very unundoable announcement. The first reading is met with raised eyebrows, the second with speculation. By the third, your fate is common knowledge. People you've never spoken to stop you in the street to comment on your match. "Oh, he's got strong calves," they say. "Excellent barley teeth." Others are less kind. "I suppose someone had to marry him," a woman mutters while measuring turnips. If anyone wishes to object, they're supposed to bring forth legitimate reasons, like a pre-existing betrothal, consanguinity, or a forgotten curse. In reality, objections are rare, but not unheard of. Occasionally, someone stands up and announces that the bride once stole a pear, or that the groom is suspiciously close with his sister's goat. The priest sighs, writes it down, and decides whether it's legally relevant or just Tuesday. Even when no one speaks, the silence is not comforting. It's filled with tension, speculation, and your grandmother whispering that she once had her banns read and still regrets it. You smile, because that's what one does when their future is being dissected by villagers who still believe sneezing during Lent is a sign of demonic possession. After the third reading, the banns are considered satisfied. No one objected loudly enough, the priest survived without cursing, and you can proceed to the ceremony knowing your humiliation has been thorough and well documented. You walk out of church with your head held high, not because you feel proud, but because you've learned to carry the weight of inevitability with posture. Congratulations. Your marriage has been officially announced. There's no turning back now. The banns have spoken. The morning of your wedding begins not with joy or even dread, but with a bucket, a wooden one filled with tepid water, 3 sprigs of something that used to be mint, and enough vinegar to clean a cauldron or strip the identity from your pores. This is your bridal bath. It's not designed for comfort or scent or even effectiveness. It's symbolic. Symbolic of purity, readiness, and the medieval belief that cleanliness is best achieved through acidity and shame. Your mother supervises the ritual like a general preparing a reluctant soldier. She scrubs, scrapes, and mutters blessings under her breath, some of which may also be curses. You're told not to complain, not to fidget, and not to breathe too enthusiastically, in case you inhale the vinegar fumes and pass out again like your cousin did last spring. When the bath is finished and your skin resembles a lightly pickled root vegetable, it's time for grooming. Your hair is brushed aggressively, then braided into something that looks ceremonial and feels like a punishment. Pins are inserted, mostly at random, and fastened with the force of someone reassembling a siege weapon. The resulting hairstyle says, "This is not about me. This is about family legacy and scalp endurance." Makeup, such as it is, involves flour, crushed herbs, and the occasional smear of animal fat. Your cheeks are reddened just enough to imply health, not enough to suggest enthusiasm. Your lips are tinted using something that smells like regret and elderberries. The final look is less blushing bride and more recently revived noblewoman. Then comes the dressing. Your wedding garments are laid out carefully. Layers upon layers of fabric stitched by great-aunts, reinforced by prayers, and last worn at a funeral 2 seasons ago. The bodice is too tight, the sleeves too long, and the hem too ambitious for someone who plans to walk. The veil smells of incense, mildew, and unresolved expectations. While you're being trussed like a ceremonial roast, your relatives drift in to offer helpful comments. "You look taller when you're nervous," says your cousin. "Your elbows are surprisingly even," notes your aunt. Your grandmother nods sagely and murmurs, "Don't trip," which is, in her own way, a blessing. You are not allowed to speak much. Brides are expected to be silent, or at least whispery. Speaking too confidently implies a sense of self, which might alarm the groom or his mother. Your role is to look serene, smell vaguely medicinal, and respond to questions with delicate nods and the occasional demure blink. As the sun climbs higher, your transformation is declared complete. You are dressed, veiled, mildly dizzy, and ceremonially silent. Someone hands you a sprig of rosemary. Someone else adjusts your veil for the 3rd time, still failing to hide your expression of vague resignation. You take one last look in the cracked mirror. You do not see joy or even fear. You see readiness. readiness to be observed, assessed, and legally claimed. You are now a bride, pickled, powdered, and prepared for duty. The groom's preparation is, unsurprisingly, a far less theatrical affair than the bride's. While she is being vinegar-bathed, braided, and emotionally exfoliated by a team of relatives with unresolved trauma, the groom is expected to do exactly 3 things: wash his face, find a tunic that doesn't actively repel birds, and remember the name of the woman he's about to marry. 2 out of 3 is considered a triumph. The process begins with what some generously call bathing. This involves splashing water on his face, sniffing his armpits, and declaring the result acceptable. If he's feeling fancy, he might rub a sprig of mint under his collarbone. If he's feeling very fancy, he might use soap, assuming someone gave it to him as a wedding gift. Hair is not styled so much as forcibly rearranged. A brother or uncle will attempt to flatten it using spit, oil, or enthusiastic palm slapping. Facial hair is allowed, even encouraged, as long as it doesn't look like an accident. The ideal is a beard that says, "I can plough a field," but not "I was raised by wolves." Then comes the robe. His wedding robe is likely his nicest tunic, or at least the one with the fewest stains. It may be embroidered with his family's crest, or more likely, with suspicious discolorations that no one discusses. A belt is added, along with a cloak if weather permits and ego demands. Footwear is optional, but recommended. Ideally, he wears shoes that match. At minimum, they both qualify as footwear. A ceremonial token is often carried, something symbolic and practical. A pouch of coins, real or imaginary, a knife polished to imply prosperity but not violence, or a sprig of something vaguely herbal to suggest he is both rustic and fertile. Occasionally, a cousin will hand him a ribbon or talisman for luck, and he'll accept it with the polite indifference of someone who has already mentally exited the conversation. While the bride is coached on posture, modesty, and eyelid behavior, the groom receives different advice. Stand up straight, don't forget your name, and if you must burp, do it quietly. His father reminds him to speak clearly during the vows and not to stare at the priest's mole again. His brother smirks and says something about wedding nights, which is met with general discomfort and a poorly hidden eye roll from his mother. No one checks if he's ready. No one asks if he's nervous. Readiness is assumed like taxation or rainfall. A groom is expected to be functional, presentable, and not visibly intoxicated, though a little wine is considered traditional, even encouraged, to soften the sharp edges of duty. Once dressed and moderately de-dusted, he stands in the doorway, squinting into the daylight, wondering how it came to this. Not with dread exactly, but with the blank acceptance of someone who has just been told they inherited a goat and a mortgage. He straightens his tunic, breathes in, and steps forward. He is ready, or close enough. If you're picturing a vision in white lace gliding down an aisle while doves coo gently in the rafters, you've confused this with a royal propaganda painting. The medieval wedding dress is not a symbol of purity, innocence, or designer craftsmanship. It's a garment of opportunity, a fabric-based compromise between tradition, availability, and whether or not the mice got to it first. There is no rule about wearing white. That idea hasn't been invented yet, and even if it had, no one has the means, or laundry technology, to maintain such fragile optimism. Instead, you wear your best outfit, not best as in new, best as in less stained than the others, only slightly cursed, and still fits if you don't breathe too deeply. The color depends on your station, your local dye merchant, and how recently your family sold their better tunics for grain. Browns, greens, and deep reds are popular. Blue is a good omen. Black is fine if you're being realistic. Patterns are minimal unless someone got enthusiastic with embroidery or was recently possessed by the spirit of aunt who sews as a coping mechanism. Most wedding garments are recycled from other ceremonies, often funerals. Your dress has almost certainly seen death before, possibly multiple times. That stain near the hem could be wine, could be memory. Either way, you wear it because it's what's available, and because your cousin's wedding was considered moderately successful, despite the fire. The gown is layered because medieval modesty insists that the only part of your body allowed to feel air is your nose. The underdress is linen. The overdress is wool unless it's summer, in which case it's still wool because suffering is timeless. You are trussed like a poultry dish awaiting seasoning, and the final effect is less radiant bride and more person being prepared for export. The veil is an essential accessory not just to cover your hair, but to keep expectations low. It is meant to suggest modesty, chastity, and that you have not recently said anything controversial. It's usually pinned or tied in place with enough force to ensure it stays on through wind, weeping, or spontaneous livestock interaction. Accessories are sparse. A simple belt, a string of inherited beads, maybe a brooch passed down from someone who once owned a hill. Flowers are optional, but only if they're seasonal and haven't been trampled by the morning cart traffic. You are handed a bouquet of herbs meant to ward off evil spirits and also help with body odor, which is both symbolic and considerate. By the time you're fully dressed, your movement is restricted to small, careful steps and ceremonial gestures. Turning around requires assistance. Sitting is theoretical, but you look the part. A woman clothed in tradition, draped in hope, and secured with 6 types of lacing. This is not a fairy tale, it's a wool-wrapped transaction, and you wear it with as much dignity as the seams will allow. You might think a wedding is complicated enough without inviting invisible forces to sabotage it, but medieval logic disagrees. In this world, love may be optional, but superstition is mandatory. A wedding isn't just a social contract, it's a spiritual obstacle course designed to confuse demons, frighten bad luck, and prevent the groom from being possessed by a mischievous forest spirit named Gerald, who once ruined a barley harvest. The preparations begin with herbs, lots of them. Rosemary for remembrance, dill for protection, lavender to keep your mother from hissing at the in-laws. You are sprinkled, stuffed, and lightly smoked in a cloud of herbal defense, like a chicken being prepped for ritual roasting. Sage is burned in corners. Rue is tucked into waistbands, and just to be safe, someone puts a sprig of mugwort in your shoe, which explains the sudden limp. Garlic is worn, not eaten. A clove is braided into your belt or hung around your neck like a fragrant, socially repellent amulet. Its purpose is to ward off witches, spirits, and overly affectionate neighbors. The stronger the smell, the better your chances of surviving both the ceremony and the reception. Iron is essential. A small piece, often a nail or horseshoe fragment, is sewn into the hem of your garment. This supposedly keeps evil at bay, though it also gives your dress the weight and comfort of a chainmail apron. One bride famously clanked her way to the altar and was later described as bravely metallic. Bells are another favorite. Tiny ones sewn into clothing or tied to the bridal bouquet are meant to scare away demons with their cheerful jingling. It's less sweet chime of joy and more aggressive wind chime in a thunderstorm. Every step you take sounds like a warning, which, to be fair, is thematically appropriate. Then there's the goat. Not every wedding features one, but when it does, you'll know. The goat is led through the village ahead of the procession and encouraged to scream. If the goat cries out 3 times, it's considered a blessing. If it cries 4, someone is cursed. If it cries continuously, it's probably just Gerald again. Even the timing of the wedding matters. Marrying on a Wednesday is lucky, Saturday is unlucky, Tuesday is for those who believe in efficiency over superstition and don't mind a little doom. The priest insists on proper blessings, but your grandmother insists on 3 knocks on the doorway, 2 clockwise spins of the bride, and 1 whispered prayer to St. Agnes, patron of awkward beginnings. Everyone participates. Someone throws salt. Someone mutters a counter curse in case the first blessing was sarcastic. A cousin with a lazy eye stares pointedly at the wedding wine to detect hexes, which is a job only she is allowed to do, and no one questions why, because in this world marriage is risky business. You're not just binding your life to another person, you're painting a target on your soul for every wandering spirit with a grudge and a flair for drama. So you do what people have always done when facing the unknown. You wear garlic, ring bells, and hope the goat screams just the right amount. You'd think a wedding day might come with a little pageantry, warmth, joy, the occasional smiling face. What you get instead is a procession that feels more like a pilgrimage to minor sainthood, or a very formal execution with better footwear. You step outside your house dressed in 20 pounds of wool and expectation, and immediately regret every decision that brought you here, especially agreeing to boots that predate your birth. The journey to the church is not long, but it is ceremonious. People have gathered not to cheer, to stare. Every neighbour, cousin, goat herder, and person you've never spoken to but who has always suspected your family of being emotionally erratic, now stands by the road, silently evaluating your posture. You walk stiffly, partly from nerves and partly because your dress has the mobility of a tent wrapped in anxiety. There are musicians, or at least people holding instruments. A flute player leads the procession, producing notes so shrill they might double as pest control. Someone bangs a drum like they're waking the dead, and you half expect to see an ancestor emerge from a nearby bush, asking if this is really the match your parents chose. Beside you walks your family. Your mother is visibly sweating through her outer robe, but pretending it's dew. Your father nods to every passerby with the seriousness of a man delivering grain to a noble. Your grandmother carries a sprig of wormwood to ward off shame and whispers prayers under her breath like a woman hoping God's too busy to notice this isn't actually going well. The church looms ahead, an old stone building with the warmth of a tax collector's smile and the charm of a crypt. It smells faintly of incense and long-held judgment. The air inside is colder than outside, which feels intentional. The stone floor echoes with each cautious step, and the pews creak like they resent your presence. A raven watches from the rafters with undisguised disdain. You are escorted to your place near the altar, under a tapestry of saints who all look vaguely disappointed. The guests filter in, whispering in tones so low they could double as curses. Your soon-to-be spouse arrives via the side entrance, flanked by relatives and looking slightly less miserable than you, which is frankly insulting. There is no music to mark his arrival, no trumpets, no soft strings, just a long pause during which several people cough and one child drops something sticky. The priest appears from the shadows like a man summoned by guilt. His robes are clean, his eyes are tired, and his smile suggests he's done this so many times he's forgotten what joy looks like. Everyone sits. You stand. The cold seeps through your boots. You resist the urge to sneeze, cry, or flee. This isn't about you. This is about legacy, land, and whether or not the 2 pigs in your dowry are still breeding. The ceremony hasn't begun yet, but the discomfort, that's well underway. You're standing at the altar, or more precisely, on a slightly raised platform that smells faintly of damp stone, burned wax, and centuries of reluctant unions. The priest stands before you, dressed in heavy robes and holier-than-thou exhaustion, ready to unite you and your equally confused partner in eternal, church-approved matrimony. The entire congregation watches in practiced silence, as if waiting for a miracle, or at least a wardrobe malfunction. The ceremony begins not with music or declarations of love, but with Latin. Lots of Latin, long passages of it, delivered in a tone somewhere between holy reverence and someone reading livestock tax codes aloud for dramatic effect. You understand nothing. You nod anyway. It's not expected that you understand, only that you don't visibly yawn or burst into flames from the sheer boredom of it all. The priest speaks directly to God, occasionally addressing you with phrases that sound important, though they might just be listing feast days or ingredients in sacramental bread. Every so often, he pauses and looks at you expectantly. This is your cue. You blink. You nod. You try to look devout and not like someone wondering if this tunic is flammable. The congregation doesn't speak. They murmur, whisper, occasionally cough in patterns that suggest emotional opinions. Your aunt dabs her eyes with a handkerchief. You'd like to believe it's from joy, but odds are she's remembering her own wedding and the goat that ruined the cake. Your future spouse stands beside you, equally stiff, possibly sweating, and definitely avoiding eye contact. You exchange exactly one glance, brief, awkward, and so emotionally neutral it could be used as a training exercise for diplomacy. You do not hold hands. You do not smile. At best, your elbows graze. It is, in its way, deeply erotic. At one point, the priest pulls out a reliquary containing something vaguely holy and mostly unidentifiable. It is waved in your direction, possibly as a blessing, possibly as a test of your resistance to incense-induced dizziness. You pass barely. Then comes the declaration, a solemn moment in which the priest announces that before God and your silently judging relatives, you are to be joined in holy matrimony. You are asked a question, perhaps a vow, perhaps a warning, and you respond with a single, tremulous, "I do," or whatever your regional variant happens to be. It could be "I will," "I accept," or simply a soft whimper interpreted as consent. The priest makes the sign of the cross. Someone rings a bell. It's unclear if that means the union is official or if lunch is being served. Either way, people stir in their pews and the energy shifts subtly from spiritual dread to logistical impatience. You are now technically married, bound not by love, not by shared dreams, but by ritual, repetition, and the deeply unsettling sense that somewhere in heaven a saint is marking this down on a scroll labeled best effort. You turn to face the exit, shoulders squared, heart undecided. The ceremony is over, but the performance has only just begun. At the heart of every medieval wedding lies the illusion of choice, and nothing showcases that more elegantly than the exchange of vows. This is the moment the Church sets aside for you to declare, publicly and under divine surveillance, that you are entering into this lifelong union willingly, or at least not while actively screaming. The priest clears his throat with the gravity of someone about to read aloud from a sacred recipe, then begins the question you've been dreading since your mother first said, "You'll learn to like him eventually." It comes in Latin or the local dialect, depending on how many goats your family donated to the church roof fund. "Do you take this man," he says, "to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And the entire room leans forward as if the answer might be anything but inevitable. You pause for half a second, not to consider the question, but to make sure your voice doesn't crack. Then you say yes, or nod, or whisper something close enough to count. And just like that, your life takes a new legal form, signed, sealed, and blessed in front of God, neighbors, livestock, and your cousin who once threw a plum at your face. Then it's the groom's turn. He is asked the same question, with slightly less tension, because everyone assumes he's agreed to this. He answers in a tone that suggests compliance, if not comprehension, and the crowd visibly relaxes. 2 affirmations, that's all it takes. Centuries of personal freedom, concluded with a muttered yes, and a nervous glance at the priest's beard. The vows themselves are not particularly romantic. There's no talk of cherishing, no promises of mutual growth or late-night conversation under the stars. What you promise is obedience, fidelity, and, for the bride, a womb of at least average reliability. The groom, in turn, pledges to provide food, shelter, and to avoid legally sanctioned abandonment. It's less of a love poem and more of a mutually agreed-upon survival pact. There is no room for negotiation. No, with this ring, I thee wed moment, accompanied by soft music and meaningful sighs. The exchange of tokens, if it happens at all, is brief and practical. A modest ring, a belt, a coin, or a ceremonial cloth passed from one family to another with the quiet finality of a business receipt. You do not gaze longingly into each other's eyes. You both gaze straight ahead, as though trying to read a distant inscription or calculate the odds of surviving the next harvest. Your hands might touch, your fingers might brush. The physical contact is accidental but, by medieval standards, emotionally explicit. With the final word spoken and the last amen muttered, the vows are done. The silence that follows is not reverent, it's logistical. The marriage is official. You have said the words, the church has witnessed them, and your parents are already mentally cataloguing which family debts have now been neutralized by this blessed transaction. You look at your spouse. Stranger, yes. Partner, maybe. Husband, definitely. Ready or not, you vowed. And now, after the Latin mumbling, the ambiguous vows, and the relentless emotional suppression, it's time for what is, in theory, the grand finale of the wedding. The kiss. That universal symbol of affection, passion, and mutual connection. Except here, it's more like sealing a contract with your face while everyone, including the village blacksmith and at least one confused chicken, watches you do it. The priest gestures with a subtle wave that somehow carries both divine authority and mild judgment. You and your new spouse turn toward each other with the careful choreography of two people reenacting affection for the first and possibly last time. There is a pause. It stretches just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Somewhere in the back, a child coughs loudly. You lean in, not quickly, nothing here happens quickly, but with the slow inevitability of a collapsing roof beam. Your faces draw close. There is the faint scent of sheep oil and ceremonial vinegar, and then contact, technically. Your lips meet in the way parchment brushes parchment, briefly, impersonally, and with no risk of combustion. It's more a suggestion of a kiss, a placeholder, a footnote to the ceremony that says, yes, we acknowledged each other's existence, briefly. There is no applause. This isn't a festival. This is a church. Reactions range from politely expressionless to visibly relieved. One of the witnesses clears his throat in what may be approval or acid reflux. Your grandmother sighs the sigh of someone who has seen 37 such kisses and only remembers 3. Your new husband steps back with all the flair of a man returning from a tax audit. You attempt a small smile. It lands somewhere between help and my veil is too tight. The priest nods in satisfaction, not because the kiss was moving, but because it happened within the bounds of ecclesiastical expectation. He promptly blesses the union, mutters something about sacred unions and proper behavior, and motions for everyone to rise. This kiss, such as it is, does not spark fireworks or awaken ancient magic. What it does is finalize the deal. It makes the marriage official in the eyes of God, the church, and that one nosy aunt who's been watching from the second pew like she's ready to file a report. It's a ritual, an obligation, a formality wrapped in wool and witnessed by poultry. You are now husband and wife. Sealed not with passion, but with pressure. United not by romance, but by structure. And kissed not with love, but with the quiet, resigned efficiency of people who know they'll be sharing a roof, a bed, and probably a latrine for the rest of their lives. There will be more kissing later. Or maybe not. That's for you and fate and your shared economic prospects to decide. But for now, you've done it. The kiss has been delivered. The crowd can exhale. The church is satisfied. And you are officially wed, with witnesses, with wine, and with as little lip movement as possible. You've survived the ceremony, the kiss, the public spiritual paperwork, and now you're escorted, if not herded, toward the next mandatory ritual, the feast. It's less a celebration and more a socially sanctioned eating event, where people gather to stare at food, talk about livestock, and pretend they're not already preparing their excuses to leave early. The banquet is held in the home of the wealthier family, or, if neither side can afford the luxury of indoor dining, under a canopy of woven reeds that technically counts as shelter. The tables, really just long planks balanced on barrels, are adorned with the finest linens available, meaning cloths that only have one stain and haven't been used as curtains in at least a month. The guests arrive in droves like pigeons sensing breadcrumbs. They bring gifts, gossip, and their very loud opinions on your marriage. Seating is loosely organized by status, bloodline, and who hasn't insulted the hosts this season. You, the newlyweds, sit at the head of the table, looking stiff, overdressed, and underfed. You're not permitted to eat yet. First, there are toasts. The toasts begin with your uncle, who is already tipsy from the pre-feast hand-washing wine and insists on offering a speech about love, loyalty, and how his own marriage lasted 15 years longer than it should have. And then someone else stands up and recites a poem about fertility that involves far too many agricultural metaphors. You sit through it with the expression of someone listening to a weather forecast for a country they'll never visit. Eventually the food is served, or rather, unveiled. Cold roasted meats, wrinkled root vegetables, flatbread that tastes like guilt, and pies filled with mysterious contents no one dares identify. There is fish, which smells like it lived a difficult life, and stewed apples that were clearly diced by someone angry at fruit. You are handed a plate. You are expected to smile. The wine, on the other hand, flows like enthusiasm from an overzealous in-law. It's strong, sour, and slightly warm from being stored near the hearth. People drink quickly as if hoping to soften the flavor of the turnips or the memory of the ceremony. By the second cup, laughter becomes easier. By the third, so does forgetting you married someone whose last name you're still not entirely sure how to pronounce. A minstrel arrives, plucks at a lute, and sings a song that may once have been romantic, but now sounds like a warning. A child screams, a dog appears, uninvited but determined, and steals half a leg of mutton. The bride's aunt claps. The groom's cousin falls into a barrel and is not retrieved. You, meanwhile, chew slowly, nod politely, and sip your wine with the caution of someone hoping not to remember any of this tomorrow. The feast is not for you, it's for them, for the village, the families, the witnesses who must now go home and say, yes, we saw it. They kissed. There was pie. It counts. Eventually, the food dwindles, the candles burn low, and the revelry slumps into a combination of digestion and denial. The guests begin to wander off, full of bread and obligation. You are not full. You are simply done. Welcome to your first married meal. Cold food, warm wine, zero joy. Once the guests are full of barley bread, sour wine, and conversation they'll regret by dawn, the wedding feast shifts to its next phase, the entertainment. It is not optional. You do not get a moment of peace. The medieval wedding, like a slow-moving theatrical disaster, insists on a final act, and this one comes with juggling, ambiguous dancing, and a lute player who believes deeply in himself and refuses to read the room. It begins with the jester, or at least the person most likely to own a hat with bells. He bounds into the center of the gathering with all the energy of someone who's had more mead than manners. He tells a joke about pigs and saints that no one understands but everyone laughs at anyway, because the wine is doing its job and because laughter is preferable to the sound of your new in-laws breathing heavily near the cheese table. Then come the dancers, local girls or hired performers, depending on your budget and the moral flexibility of your aunt's purse strings. They enter in a flurry of veils and elbow-led choreography, swirling to a rhythm that's only occasionally aligned with the music. Their movements are meant to be graceful and symbolic, though most guests interpret them as either romantic or deeply prophetic, depending on how many cups in they are. One elderly man claps too enthusiastically and is gently escorted away before he hurts himself or declares love to a tapestry. You watch, expression fixed, hands folded, pretending not to notice the subtle argument unfolding between your cousin and the juggler who just dropped an apple onto the priest's lap. And of course there's the lute. Always the lute. Played by a man who introduces himself with a bow so deep it feels like performance art. He plucks out a wandering melody, sings in a key not found in nature, and insists each song has a story. You listen to the tale of a doomed knight and his misunderstood donkey, while your new spouse stares into the fire as though reconsidering everything. At some point, someone attempts a communal dance. It's a local tradition involving linked arms, uneven footwork, and an impressive number of stubbed toes. You are encouraged, dragged, really, into the circle. You move as instructed, smiling stiffly, while silently counting the seconds until you can sit down and return to pretending this is all a dream you'll wake up from. The entertainment continues with increasingly dubious acts. A boy balancing spoons on his face, a woman who claims to communicate with bees, and two guests reenacting a scene from a folktale that ends with someone falling into the soup. Applause is scattered, laughter is loud, dignity is nowhere to be found, and yet this is what joy looks like, or at least what passes for joy in a village where 3 goats qualify as a parade. You're not entertained exactly, but you are distracted, and that, it turns out, is the entire purpose. You married a stranger today, you dined like a peasant in a pageant, and now you're clapping for a man balancing bread knives on his knees, because nothing says happily ever after quite like being serenaded by a lute and mild confusion. By the time the last guest finishes their 5th cup of wine and the lute player has been politely escorted into the goat shed, it's time for the final ritual of the day, the bedding. In modern terms, this would be considered a private moment, a gentle closing to a long day. In medieval terms, however, it's a team-building exercise with uncomfortable eye contact, forced cheering, and an overwhelming smell of candle wax and judgment. The newlyweds are paraded to the marriage bed by a cluster of relatives and close friends who have decided, for reasons lost to time and decency, that this moment must be witnessed, endorsed, and possibly narrated. You are not allowed to walk there unaccompanied. You are flanked on all sides like royalty being marched into exile. People sing, people shout advice, someone throws herbs. No one seems to find this strange. The marriage bed itself is often prepped like a ceremonial crime scene. Clean sheets, fresh straw, and a subtle arrangement of rosemary and rue to encourage fertility and discourage awkward silences. The mattress is lumpy, the bed frame squeaks ominously, and someone's great-aunt has placed a small loaf of bread on the windowsill for luck. You are not allowed to ask questions. Once you reach the threshold, the crowd erupts in theatrical applause. Someone tries to make a joke about ploughing fields. Someone else mutters a half-remembered prayer. You are both ushered into the room as if entering a wrestling ring. And then, surprise, you are expected to get undressed, with witnesses. Not all of them stay, thankfully, but a few selected honor guards remain nearby, presumably to ensure that no one escapes through a window or fakes a headache too convincingly. Depending on local custom, the priest may say a final blessing outside the door, invoking Saint Agnes or Saint Valentine, or whichever poor soul was assigned to be patron of awkwardness. The guests gradually drift away, leaving behind a trail of wilted herbs, half-drunk goblets, and emotionally scarred children who will one day write about this in their journals, if journals existed. And now the real pressure begins. You are expected to consummate the marriage, not eventually, immediately. This isn't about romance, it's about legitimacy. Until this act occurs, the marriage is only technically binding. To make it spiritually, socially, and legally inescapable, someone has to emerge tomorrow holding a sheet and the authority to declare it successful. You and your new spouse sit at the edge of the bed, side by side, possibly the closest you've been all day. You exchange a look. Not one of passion, more of mutual disbelief. You do not know each other. You do not love each other. But now you must do something that is both deeply personal and deeply regulated by family, tradition, and mid-tier theology. There is no guidance, no candlelit intimacy, just duty, and hope that the bed doesn't collapse before you do. Because in medieval weddings, love might wait. But performance, that's due tonight. In the modern world, a wedding night might begin with a gentle fade to black soft lighting and the promise of privacy. In the medieval world, it begins with a crowd, an actual crowd, of people cheering, possibly singing, definitely drunk. The bedding ceremony isn't just tradition, it's a full-blown group activity with a suspiciously festive tone for something that's about to be, at best, awkward, and at worst, legally traumatizing. The idea is simple. Escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber with all the subtlety of a military parade, and then ceremonially prepare them for the night's duties. The execution, however, is less romantic escort and more unwilling relay race through your last remaining dignity. You are surrounded by relatives, friends, and at least one person whose role is still unclear, but who is very excited to be involved. The crowd carries torches, candles, baskets of fruit, and unsolicited advice. Your uncle sings a bawdy folk song about geese that no one asked for. Your cousin is already placing bets on whether you'll produce a boy before next harvest. You're not allowed to carry anything yourself. This includes your blanket, your future, and the last shred of your autonomy. Once inside the chamber, you are not left alone. Not immediately. There are still traditions to uphold. The bed is inspected. The linens are straightened. Someone sprinkles herbs. Someone else places symbolic objects around the room, including a loaf of bread, a coin, and an egg. Why? No one remembers. But it would be bad luck not to. Then the undressing begins, not by choice, by committee. Depending on local custom and how far your family has leaned into the whole ritual humiliation theme, you might be helped out of your clothes by a sibling, a servant, or a very enthusiastic aunt who believes this builds community. Your spouse receives the same treatment. It is a strange, disjointed process, part wedding, part livestock inspection. Eventually, the room clears, mostly. Sometimes a witness remains outside the door, sometimes just outside the curtain. Sometimes there's an actual chair placed nearby for someone to sit and wait for the sounds of legitimacy. This person is usually an elder, a midwife, or someone who lost a bet. You and your new spouse lie in bed close enough to hear each other breathe, but still unsure whether eye contact is a marital obligation. There is no candlelight, no romantic tension, just the expectation that something will happen, and quickly, so that everyone outside can sleep, knowing the family name has been legally and anatomically confirmed. There may be prayers, there may be jokes, there may be silence so thick it hums.
And somewhere, probably outside the window, a goat screams.
This is not intimacy, this is not connection, this is pageantry, a public affirmation that what was arranged has now been enacted, and that yes, someone will be inspecting the sheets in the morning. Once the door closes and the final relative has stopped shouting encouraging advice through the wall, you're left alone. Just you, your new spouse, a bed that smells faintly of mildew and rosemary, and a silence so heavy it might qualify as a third witness. The candles flicker. The blanket itches. Your heart races, but not from desire. More from the creeping realization that you've reached the most intimate moment of your life. And it's fully scheduled.
You lie side by side, fully aware that your entire village expects you to do something productive with your night. You're not even sure what counts as productive. Is there a time limit? A proper technique? Is there supposed to be eye contact, or would that violate a social code? You could ask, of course, but that would involve speaking, which feels about as natural as sprouting wings and flying out the window. Sex, in the medieval sense, is not about connection or passion, it's about obligation. You do it because the church says so, the family expects it, and the local midwife already has a list of names prepared for your hypothetical offspring. Consent is assumed, conversation is minimal, and satisfaction is considered suspicious. If anyone smiles during the process, it's probably an accident.
There's pressure, but not the flattering kind. You're not expected to be romantic, skilled, or even particularly present. You're just expected to begin. The act itself is treated as a necessity, like sowing a field or paying taxes, but with fewer instructions and more personal consequences. You aren't supposed to enjoy it, at least not visibly. You're supposed to endure it gracefully and hope no one outside the door hears anything louder than a sigh. Your new spouse is just as confused. Maybe they look nervous. Maybe they pretend not to be. Maybe they attempt a joke that lands somewhere between a blessing and a threat. You consider responding with something witty, but instead nod in a way that says, "I acknowledge this tension and would like to proceed with minimal trauma." Eventually, you touch, awkwardly, accidentally, and with all the tenderness of two people trying to assemble a tent during a thunderstorm. There is no music, no poetry, no reassuring montage. Just fumbling limbs, uncertain breathing, and the constant awareness that tomorrow someone will ask, "Well, did you?" With the giddy impatience of a gossip-fueled bookmaker. You do your best, or you don't. Sometimes exhaustion wins. Sometimes fear. Sometimes the idea of trying to make love to someone whose name you still only half remember just feels too absurd to entertain. You roll over. You breathe. You wait for the morning. Because in the end, this isn't about passion. It's about duty. It's about beginning the next chapter of your life under the unblinking gaze of social expectation and faint candlelight. You may have married in public, but you consummate in silence. By morning, your marriage is no longer just a rumor with Latin backing. It's a physical, documented reality, or at least it should be. Because in the medieval world, love isn't measured in affection or even vows. It's measured in blood, specifically a small, questionably hygienic smear of it on a piece of linen, carefully inspected by people who absolutely should not be involved. The proof of virginity is one of those time-honored traditions that somehow survived despite its obvious absurdity and total lack of scientific credibility. The logic goes something like this. If the bride is pure, the act of consummation will leave behind evidence, visible, stainable, cheer-worthy evidence. That evidence is usually presented on a sheet, waved in front of elders like a victory flag at a farming tournament, and followed by loud declarations such as "it is done," or "praise be," or "now we can all go home." This moment is not private, it is not quiet, it is, in fact, scheduled into the next morning's proceedings. A designated female relative, typically a midwife, an aunt, or a very assertive neighbor, is tasked with collecting the sheet, examining it, and confirming its contents with all the ceremony of a courtroom exhibit. She may sniff, prod, or mutter prayers over it. She may even offer commentary which no one asked for, but everyone listens to. If there is blood, the family rejoices. You are declared virtuous. Your mother beams. Your father nods with the satisfaction of a man who invested in a good grain harvest. Your husband's family celebrates too, though with a slightly smug undertone as if they helped. Guests clap. Bread is shared. Someone writes a song. You are, for all intents and purposes, exonerated by your own bed linens. But if there is no blood, or things get complicated, explanations are demanded, eyebrows are raised, panic ensues. Your mother might cry. Your aunt might suggest divine punishment. Your cousin starts whispering about that one time you tripped near a stable boy and didn't apologize fast enough. The priest is summoned. He asks questions. He recommends prayer. He does not recommend leniency. What no one mentions is that not all women bleed. What no one cares about is basic anatomy. The expectation is clear. Purity leaves a mark. If it doesn't, someone must answer for it, and that someone is usually you. In some villages, the sheet is displayed publicly, sometimes hung from a window, sometimes draped over a chair, like a grim tablecloth of honor. It's meant to signal to the community that the marriage is not just legal, but spiritually and biologically validated. People pass by, they nod, they comment. Good fabric, someone says. Nice shade, says another. No one ever asks how you feel, because in this culture, your body is evidence, your privacy is irrelevant, and your dignity is secondary to the social hunger for confirmation. And if that sounds invasive, it is. But it's tradition, which, in medieval terms, is just another word for you're not allowed to question it. The wedding is over, the guests have gone home, the leftover stew has been packed into increasingly suspicious jars, and the wine-soaked minstrel has been dragged out of the well. You, however, are still here, married, bedded, bled, and now officially a wife. Or, depending on which side of the dowry you were on, a husband with a slightly improved sheep-to-person ratio. Either way, the confetti has settled, or would have if confetti had been invented, and your life as a newly married person has begun. You wake up next to your spouse, possibly for the first time ever, possibly still unsure of which direction they face when they sleep. There's a moment of awkward breathing, a nod, a brief, silent exchange that basically translates to, well, I guess we live together now. As a wife, your status changes immediately and dramatically. You are no longer a daughter, you are now someone's legal possession, folded into his household, his family tree, and his property taxes. You don't just marry a man, you marry his livestock, his debts, and his mother's opinions. Your name might change, or it might not, depending on how many vowels were in your original one and whether the scribe was having a good day. Your duties begin before breakfast. These are not metaphorical duties. These are literal, domestic, spiritually sanctioned chores that will define your new life. Managing the hearth, feeding the animals, boiling water, spinning wool, and somehow maintaining modesty while elbow deep in fermented cabbage. If you're lucky, there's a servant to help. If you're really lucky, the servant isn't just you with a new title. For husbands, marriage means responsibility too, owning land, paying taxes, protecting the household, and pretending to know what crop rotation is. You're expected to be a provider, which in this economy mostly means not dying in the next war. You might also be called upon to settle disputes, attend councils, and explain repeatedly that yes, you know your wife has opinions, and no, you don't know where she learned to read. Emotionally speaking, no one asks how it's going. No one checks if you're happy. Happiness is not the goal, stability is. If you are not arguing in public or selling family assets out of spite, your marriage is considered a success. Small talk is encouraged as long as it revolves around harvest yields, goat ailments, or which neighbors might be witches. Privacy, of course, is still not a thing. Everyone knows when you argue. Everyone knows when you're trying for a child. Everyone knows what you ate last night because your mother-in-law stood in the doorway while you chewed and whispered, "You're holding your spoon wrong." You are now part of a household unit, a legal entity, a taxable, observable, neighbor-reviewed marriage package. Love might grow, or it might not. No one cares. Because you're not two souls entwined.
You're one social obligation, split between two people who still aren't quite sure if they're allowed to laugh.
Now that the wedding is behind you, the bedding has been survived, and your name is officially inked onto a page next to someone else's grain allotment, it's time to settle into married life. This phrase conjures images of warmth, partnership, and shared goals, until you realize those goals include don't starve, don't freeze, and try not to curse at each other while gutting fish. Domestic life in a medieval household is many things: predictable, rigid, and aggressively underheated. Bliss? Less so. You're expected to wake at dawn, pray with your spouse, then immediately begin working within 10 feet of each other without making eye contact or questioning how this became your reality. For wives, that means cooking, mending, preserving, spinning, and pretending not to notice when your in-laws comment on the thickness of your porridge. For husbands, it means ploughing, mending roofs, lifting things without complaint, and maintaining the illusion of complete emotional neutrality. The division of labor is not flexible. You don't get to say, "You handle the chickens today, I'll deal with existential despair." Tasks are assigned based on gender, class, and which of you can kneel longer without audibly groaning. You become a team, but not the fun kind, more like two oxen yoked together for life, trudging through the mud with shared fatigue and different interpretations of what counts as done. There is no privacy. Your home, if you're lucky, has 2 rooms. If you're unlucky, it has 1 room and an inconveniently social goat. You sleep, eat, and raise children within the same walls, often with your mother-in-law sleeping 12 feet away and pretending to be asleep while mentally cataloguing your shortcomings. There is no locking the door. There might not even be a door. Intimacy, meanwhile, becomes functional. Sex is expected, but rarely discussed. Affection is shown through subtle acts, bringing in firewood without being asked, sharing the good blanket, or not pointing out that your spouse is storing onions in the bed again. A successful marriage is one where both parties remain civil, productive, and only occasionally fantasize about joining a monastery just for the personal space. Communication is less about deep emotional connection and more about updates. The barley's mouldy. Your brother's here again. I think the baby licked a toad. You do not write poetry to one another. You do not share long walks unless you're chasing escaped livestock. You do, however, develop a rhythm, a silent, chore-based rapport built on habit, obligation, and the shared relief of not being currently on fire. Your social life shrinks to include only people with the same marital exhaustion. You nod politely to other couples in the marketplace with the same defeated optimism that says, "We too have learned to communicate through sighs." This is married life, not glamorous, not lyrical, but, in its own quietly enduring way, successful. You work, you manage, you survive. You even laugh, rarely, but when it happens, it echoes longer than it should, because in a world without choice, getting by together is as close to joy as it gets. You may have thought that marriage was a union between two people. That's adorable. What you've actually married into is a network, no, a swarm of new relatives who will now occupy your home, your personal space, and your mental bandwidth until death or the next famine do you part. They don't arrive all at once. They trickle in like smoke through roof cracks, like regret. If you're the bride, congratulations. You now live with your husband's family, not near them, with them, under one roof, usually made of thatch and opinions. You share a kitchen, a courtyard, a hearth, and, unfortunately, several moods. The mother-in-law has already claimed the warmest stool and the moral high ground. The father-in-law gives advice without punctuation. The unmarried sister is always watching, quietly judging your posture and questioning whether your stew is emotionally balanced. Your husband, bless him, insists it won't be so bad. They're just family, he says, as if that phrase has ever brought comfort in the history of arranged marriages. You nod, you smile. You spend the next few weeks learning the subtle art of expressing rage with a perfectly timed wooden spoon drop. If you're the groom, don't feel too smug. Your own family is now watching your wife like she's a suspicious goat that wandered into the kitchen. They critique everything, how she walks, how she speaks, how she doesn't speak enough, and why she hasn't yet produced a child, a feast, or a satisfactory explanation for her eyebrow shape. Your mother is torn between passive-aggressively correcting her and overtly doing everything for her while muttering about standards. Boundaries do not exist. There is no privacy. Your bedroom is separated from the common area by a curtain, and that curtain does nothing to muffle the sound of your father-in-law loudly describing his bunion symptoms. Conversations are rarely private, and any argument will be overheard, evaluated, and later referenced during dinner with a phrase like, "Well, some people don't appreciate constructive feedback. You cannot escape them." Even a walk to the well turns into a group outing. Your chores are observed, your rest is timed, and your cough is diagnosed by 3 elders with differing herbal philosophies. Occasionally, a cousin appears unannounced and just stays for a week or a season. No one explains why, it's just what family does. Still, the worst part isn't the noise, the crowding, or the commentary, it's the unspoken power structure. You may be married, but the house is not yours. The hierarchy is set in stone, passed down through bitter anecdotes and deeply territorial teacups. You will earn your place, not with love, not with effort, but with sheer, soul-weary endurance. Over time, you adapt. You learn whose mood swings signal rain. You learn which complaints are actually compliments. You learn that saying with the right tone can end an argument. You survive. Because in-laws like mildew and medieval tax collectors cannot be avoided.
Only tolerated graciously, and from the far side of the bread table.
By now, you and your spouse have settled into a rhythm. Not necessarily a harmonious one, more like the rhythm of two oxen yoked together, trudging silently through mud with mutual respect and minimal eye contact. And yet in this subdued, practical partnership, something strange begins to happen. You stop expecting conversation. You stop waiting for declarations. Instead, you learn to speak the ancient marital language of silence. Talking, as it turns out, is not a cornerstone of medieval marriage. Most couples communicate through gestures, grunts, and the strategic placement of household objects. A broom left leaning against the doorway. That means I fixed the leak. A bowl of stew delivered without eye contact. That says, I remember you exist and you're not dead yet. A heavy sigh at bedtime. That could mean anything from the chickens escaped to I hate you with quiet, enduring intensity. At first, this lack of verbal connection feels unsettling. Shouldn't a marriage involve shared thoughts, dreams, discussions about feelings and aspirations? But then you realize feelings are expensive, words are risky. One misplaced sentence about the way your spouse trims their beard or peels their onions, and you've started a 3-day Cold War monitored closely by your in-laws and narrated by your neighbors. So you adapt. You develop a kind of emotional echolocation, reading each other's moods through footstep tempo, sigh volume, and how forcefully the bread is kneaded. Silence becomes comfort. A shared pause over morning porridge becomes the height of intimacy. You learn that love doesn't need to be said aloud when it can be implied through joint wood chopping. Sometimes you do speak, but only in context. Questions like, have you seen the bucket? Or did we survive the storm? Are perfectly acceptable. Anything more philosophical is met with raised eyebrows and a change of subject. The phrase I love you doesn't exist in your vocabulary, but I didn't forget the leaks hits just as hard. You discover entire emotional spectrums in the way your spouse closes the door. You hear apology in the way they refill your cup. You notice tenderness in how they leave the warm side of the bed undisturbed. No poetry, no confessions, just quiet acts that say, I notice you, and I choose not to throw a turnip at your head today. Silence in this world is not emptiness, it's space, it's restraint, it's survival. In a life filled with noise, goats, gossip, storms, church bells, this quiet understanding is the closest thing to peace you can find. You may never have a heart-to-heart beneath the stars, but you'll share a blanket without arguing. You'll pass each other a cup without asking. And sometimes, in the stillness of an early morning, you'll sit side by side without speaking for an entire hour. And in that silence, you'll hear everything you need. In a world where time is measured by harvests, plagues, and how many roof tiles survived the last storm, the concept of an anniversary feels almost suspiciously sentimental. There's no calendar hanging in your hut with a little heart drawn around your wedding date. There's no date night, no bouquet, no awkward attempt at poetry, followed by an apology and a beat. What you have is memory, sort of, and a vague awareness that about a year ago, something legally binding and mildly traumatic took place. Anniversaries, as we know them today, don't exist in medieval life. You don't get flowers, you don't get gifts. If you're lucky, you get a slightly warmer bowl of stew and the privilege of not being asked to scrub turnip barrels for an evening. If you're very lucky, your spouse remembers on their own, pauses while chewing, and says something romantic like, "Didn't we do this last year?" You spend your days working, surviving, and occasionally wondering why the bread is angrier than usual. The exact date of your wedding is less important than whether your ox has gone lame or if your child has started speaking in tongues again. Still, there's a faint tug when the season changes and the air smells the same as it did that day, the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and barely concealed dread. You may remember your wedding by the goose that attacked your veil, or the lute player who fell asleep in the soup, or the screaming goat that ruined your vows. These are your milestones, your markers. They rise to the surface like odd memories that can't quite be pinned to a specific day, only to a vague time when people cared deeply about which family owed vinegar to whom. If anyone else remembers your anniversary, it's usually a relative. A meddling cousin who drops by to ask if you've produced an heir yet, or your mother-in-law who casually mentions, "Your father and I celebrated 40 years this month," with the pride of someone who thinks passive-aggressive silence is a form of marital glue. Celebrating isn't expected. But sometimes something small happens. Your spouse saves the better piece of bread for you. You boil the bath water an extra few degrees warmer. You both sit by the fire a little longer, neither of you talking, both of you thinking the same thing. We're still here, somehow. There's no toast, no music, no emotional speech that begins with, "This past year with you." What there is presence. Continuity. The quiet knowledge that neither of you walked off into the woods and stayed there, that you endured each other and maybe even learned how to do it with a little grace. And really, in this world where nothing soft survives long, what more could you want? So you mark the occasion not with grandeur, but with survival, a shared turnip, a nod, a moment of recognition that yes, a year has passed and no one died or burned anything important. Happy anniversary. Now, back to the cabbages. Marriage in the medieval world may be intended as a lifelong bond, but let's be honest. Life doesn't tend to last that long. Between plagues, poor diet, livestock-related accidents, and the occasional armed conflict, the odds of both spouses living to old age together are only slightly better than the odds of a chicken learning Latin. So naturally, society had to develop a very pragmatic approach to what happens when one of you inevitably dies. If you're the one left behind, there is grief, of course. Quiet, dutiful grief. The kind you wear like an extra shawl and display at meals, so the neighbours don't think you're heartless. But grief must be efficient because fields still need tending, goats still need milking, and your in-laws, bless them, are already discussing what to do with the room the deceased used to sleep in. For widows, the process is immediate. You don a mourning veil, shift your tone to reverently tired, and prepare for a subtle social demotion. If your husband was a landowner, you might inherit a portion of his estate, enough to survive, not enough to relax. If you're lucky, you remain in the home as a respected figurehead. If you're unlucky, his cousin moves in and starts asking about your pickling methods like he owns the place. Because now, technically, he might. Remarriage is not only permitted, it's encouraged. Widows are considered prime candidates for strategic pairings. You've proven fertility, or at least survival. You probably come with a working knowledge of bread maintenance and your dowry's already been paid. It's practically recycling. Within weeks there may be whispers about a carpenter down the road, or a minor noble who's recently misplaced his third wife to bad mutton. If you're the widower, the transition is even smoother. Society assumes you'll remarry. Quickly. Ideally to someone younger, quieter, and with a pulse. Emotional processing is optional, logistics are not. You'll be expected to secure a new wife before your children start asking who's going to mend their tunics, or remind them not to eat the decorative onions. And then there's the village response. People will say kind things like, "She was a fine woman," or "He always paid his debts," followed immediately by, "So, who's available now?" Mourning etiquette dictates you wait a respectful amount of time before moving on, usually just long enough to finish the stew from the funeral. In some cases, the church steps in. There may be prayers, a memorial, a sermon about divine will, and the importance of remembering that marriage was never meant to be fun anyway. But the church, too, quietly expects you to find a new partner. Marriage is not a love story, it's an institution, and institutions require staffing. Of course, in rare cases, love did happen. Some spouses genuinely missed each other. Some planted trees, wrote verses, wore black for longer than fashion dictated. But more often, life went on with the same quiet insistence that had governed everything else. Because in a world of short lifespans and long winters, you don't marry once, you marry until death. And then, if you're still standing, you marry again. Years have passed, or maybe decades, Time doesn't announce itself here, it just layers on like soot in the rafters and stiffness in the knees. Your wedding robe has long since been repurposed into curtains. Your veil became a tablecloth, and the vinegar from your dowry is now older than your eldest child. You live in the same house with the same spouse, under the same roof that creaks like it has opinions about your choices. You're still married. It's not a storybook marriage. There were no passionate declarations, no poetic reunions, no dramatic separations followed by teary-eyed reconciliations in the rain. What you had was rain, definitely. Just without the conversation, you've learned to share silence like other couples share hobbies. It has texture now, depth, a kind of mutual nod to the understanding that neither of you is going anywhere, mostly because the cart is broken and the road to town is flooded again. Your days are quiet, measured by chores and seasons. You rise, you work, you sleep. Occasionally, you exchange sentences, not many, enough. A comment about the weather, a question about firewood, a remark about your neighbour's suspiciously fat goose. So these exchanges feel like luxury, like wine on a feast day. You savour them, then return to your quiet. There are moments, though, moments that feel like love, or whatever love becomes after it's been boiled, salted, and left to cool for 20 years. A shared laugh over a burnt crust. A glance when the goat escapes and you both pretend not to see it. The way they hand you your cloak without looking. The way you pour their tea without asking. You've had children, maybe. Or you haven't. Either way, you've raised something, humans, livestock, crops yourself. You've survived. Which in this world is not a small thing. It's the biggest thing. Bigger than feelings. Bigger than vows. Survival is the daily I do that neither of you says aloud, but both of you keep showing up for.
Your in-laws are mostly dead. Your friends are mostly tired. Your hands ache in the morning. Your knees ache in the evening. But you sit beside each other at dusk, watching smoke curl from the hearth, not touching, not speaking, and somehow saying everything.
You no longer remember exactly what was said at your wedding. You're not even sure you heard it properly at the time, but the marriage has lasted long past the feast, the bedding, the awkward jokes, and the goat-related incidents. It has outlived expectations. It has become something solid and strange and deeply rooted. No one writes poems about this kind of love. There are no songs, no ballads, just two people who stayed, who endured, who remembered which teacup was whose, who argued silently about firewood, but always left the good blanket folded on the other's side of the bed. And in that silence, stubborn, ordinary, absolute, you find something resembling peace.
You are still married.
And it turns out that counts for something.